Welcome everybody. So you're filing into our Zoom squares. Thanks for being here. This is the Brooklyn Rail's 610th New Social Environment. I'm Carolyn, a programs associate here at the Rail, and I have the extreme pleasure of being your MC today for a conversation featuring Brandon Ndife and Andrew Woolbright. And we're really thrilled to welcome poet and writer and filmmaker Miko Revereza here to close today's program. Before we get started, the Brooklyn Rail acknowledges Black Lives Matter. Here in New York, we are on Lenape-Hoking, the unceded land and waters of the Wappinger, Canarsie, Munsee, and Lenni Lenape people of the Delaware Nation and Shinnecock Indian Nation. And we encourage you to check the chat in just a moment. You can view today's event and our full archive on the Rail's YouTube channel. And we would like to thank the Terra Foundation for sponsoring our NSE program and making these daily combos possible. And with that, I will introduce our guest and host. Born in 1991 in Hammon, Indiana, Brandon Ndife lives and works in New York, New York. He received a BFA from the Cooper Union and an MFA from Bard. Some of his most recent solo and two-person exhibitions include My Zone at Bureau, New York, Minor Twin Worlds with Diane Severin Nguyen, also at Bureau, Ties That Bind at Shoot the Lobster, Just Passin Thru at Interstate Projects, and Meanderthal at Species Atlanta. Our host today is artist, curator, and critic Andrew Woolbright, who's based in Brooklyn and is an MFA graduate from RISD. Woolbright is the founder and director of the Gallery Below Grand, located on the Lower East Side. In addition to curating, he is a regular contributor to the Brooklyn Rail. In 2021, Woolbright curated the show Density Betrays Us with Angela Dufresne and Cash Ragona at The Hole, and will be curating shows at Provincetown Fine Arts Work Center and Hesse Flatow this summer. So with that, thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to pass it over to Andrew.
Hi, everyone. Thank you always, the Rail team, for making these talks happen every single day and all of the work, the invisible work that goes into making that happen so seamlessly. So thank you, and thank you to all of you who are attending this on a wonderfully gray day to listen to a conversation about art. And thank you for making the time in this busy summer to do so. I'm so excited to get to talk to Brandon today about his really engaging, thoughtful practice. It starts with copies and gets to something more totemic and important and transcendent by starting with like an index of something. So hi, Brandon, how you doing?
Hey, Andrew. Nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course, of course. So yeah, let's get right into it because we have a lot to talk about today and excited to do so. So Brandon, talking about your sculptural practice, like I said, you usually start with casting and copying as like a form and finding materials as they exist in real space and then kind of bringing them into your studio to conjure something. And this seems like a really good example of that.
Yeah, I would say that my process is usually found through a daily habit of looking down and around, my surrounding area, my environment, here in Brooklyn and just overall in New York. There is a lot of very, what I think, thoughtful and maybe even transcendent, like you were talking about earlier, moments that are at random or at these very, specific moments that are maybe not even intended. And for me, I like to think of the world very tactile and materially. And so every day, is inspiration for me to go back into the studio and just think about systems at large that we're kind of dealing with and that we're born into. And for me, I like to think about these objects so closely to our bodies, to our minds, and these are the things that we inhabit every day. And so why not a better way to kind of engage with the world with, you know, going about our daily habits. And for me, it's never so severed from that kind of simple thought that we are just here existing. And I try and embed a lot of these thoughts in the work, to try and just elucidate more about our lived condition.
Well, I love, you're so, I mean, there's so many great qualities about this work, but in that first slide, I really like the orientation of it. There's a stacking that kind of happens as things get left out on the curb for someone else to take, that takes these things and takes the orientation we're used to seeing them and flips them around. And there's a cleverness to the way you're resituating these objects that take us to how you're coming across them and finding them, I feel like.
Yeah. I think that there's something that happens, there's some kind of activation that happens where an object that we're used to seeing, you know, in our four walls of our home or any dwelling, and what really, there's that uncanny switch that happens to an object just when you change you know, its basic composition and constitution, whether that's by color, by weight, texture, and even just other intrinsic things about an object. And so for me, so much about the work is recognizing, but almost a non-recognition at the same time. And for me, I think those things switch and kind of oscillate back and forth to being recognizable or unrecognizable just in their own life cycle. I'm really interested in the thought that objects, much like ourselves, have a life cycle, and whether that comes down to use or neglect, or if there's the elements at large that are above us all that kind of dictate when an object is heading out, or one is almost like a palimpsest being kind of butted up or you know, jostled on top of or into. And so those are those kind of forms that I try and emulate in the studio, is their basic constitution, but what would happen if, you know, some invisible force, some prior happening were to alter that basic kind of recognition of one thing, and does it turn into another when that switch happens?
I love that. If we go back one slide before we move on to it, I think that life cycle and palimpsest is made really literal in this piece, that you have these artificial gourds kind of growing inside this like tertiary, you're turning the shelves into like layers of earth and ground, and really implying this excavation so literally in a way that I love. But it's also like, I mean, you come from a background in painting, and for me, this piece that really translates that each shelf really has like a composition of still life in a way that I really enjoy. Is still life something that you think about often, right? Or like kind of recompositioning those things through your work?
Yeah, I tend to think in still life, and I feel like it's a really great device for me to see my work through. And you know, there's the literal kind of sense of a still life being static objects arranged, and like, you know, I also think that in everyday situations we're not really thinking so much about it, but where we have certain still lifes arranged throughout our life and throughout our day, you know, whether keys, wallet, phones clump together on one side of the table, or is it like, you know, the 5 mugs of coffee that kind of congregate to one side of the kitchen or something like that. And you know, it's for me a really good mimetic or sort of journalistic moment, and we were talking about this journalistic moment earlier, and I'll get to that. But just thinking about a recording of a time through objects, and you can really get a sense of place and even intent if you were to like look even further with the still life. What is arranged, and like what is ours, and why do we keep them in one place? And so for me, composition and color, traditionally being a painter, is so much of a portal into the work. And I talk about portals of my work a lot because, I am taking raw material and arranging it as if it's, plucked from some recent excavation or some recent happening. And so for me, composition is really important because, I get to play with what is seen and unseen, and, just the way things congregate and stack up in our lives. Some things have reached to the fore, and some recede into the background. And, that's in itself, like, conceptually, a still life can read in the same way, where which objects are in the fore background can really talk about, just time. It's a subtle way to think about time. You go to a grocery store, the older box of cereal is in the back and the newer stock is up front, right? So it's really about how to think about space and time in a certain way. And when I think about making things from scratch, and we talk a lot about objects in the round, right? The way I apply color is going to read differently with how I'm trying to illustrate how old or how used an object is. And so composition is important, and is just as important almost as any other material probably would be.
Absolutely. I mean, maybe we should start there, just for those maybe not super familiar with your work, which is that artifice plays such a critical role within everything. To watch your studio practice, it's taking casts of things you're finding, making polyurethane and resin casts of them, making molds and then making casts, and then a lot of pigmentation to get this thing that at the end, it loses a lot of that artifice. There's this like kind of dark humor, this interesting thing, and playing with dead things and fake things versus real, and these forgeries that really make this thing magical, like you said. And you're really able to play the role of like this like temporal like scientist, or this journalist that gets to age things as you want them to be, and structure time with these objects.
Yeah. I'd like to think that we all have sort of a capacity to absorb an aura or erratic kind of sensory familiarity or engagement with things that are at a remove from us or at a distance, right? And so, I take on a lot of the processes of even like set design or production design, because for me, it's not so much of the complications of like real world material or real world access in my work to those materials. Like, say for instance, if I'm making a cast of a watermelon, I reason that I don't necessarily need the real thing for the idea to come across. And in fact, that static nature of something manufactured to be the real thing, it's, a picture lasts longer. Take a picture so it'll last longer. And so for me, that cast is almost like a photograph in the round. And it's so much of the materials that I use often is like these pigmented resins and the and insulation foams and you know, these earth pigments that I conjure up, these like dirt and glue. And for me, it's just enough. You know, you don't necessarily need to get up and get the stench of the thing, but your mind already kind of goes there. So for me, I like to bring the audience to the door and say, go up as close as you want, if you want, but exactly at what point will you say, like, okay, I think the gist of this in my body is enough here. And in that way, I'm actually trying to just be more economical with even the tussle of context that I'm actually trying to bring up. Like, I don't want to be producing waste if I'm going to be thinking about vegetables, or if I'm going to be thinking about time and conglomerations of goods. Like, I don't want to now fall into that gyre of the economics of that, right? So I want to bring up the ideas more so than the real thing and the weight of it. I think I want it to be more of a metaphysical weight than any kind of gyre of the production of goods. And yeah.
Well, it's really nice seeing, you know, there's so many, I feel like there are a lot of sculptors that shy away from using resins and plastics anymore, or apply some type of ethics to it or morality to it. And like you said, there's a different kind of morality to making something that'll last forever. And I also think that what's more American and what's more of the now to like artificially preserve the world as we're losing it. You know, there's something really romantic, like you've talked about reclamation in your work before, you said it now, that there's this I don't know, are you comfortable with the terms like romantic or surrealist enchantment of trying to preserve these things? Is that fair to say, or is that too sentimental?
I mean, I think there is a part of me that enjoys that romantic feeling, or that this kind of idea of you know, preservation or reclamation. I think for me, it's a vernacular that some in our care, in our community, don't even have a choice to be so cavalier with what they have, right? And so, you know, I take maybe that romanticism pretty seriously. I think that there are folks, and there are those in various communities that I'm around that, you know, how many times can you tape a broom together to use it, right? And so how many times can you bondo something to try and keep it afloat here? And so there's an economy of means that I don't really take for granted as an artist who's really concerned about recycling and being, you know, one who uses every bone of the animal, so to speak. So I try and be sincere about how much I can get out of a raw material. And so if that's a feeling that can come across, you know, that's goal number one in the work. But if it's two, for me to really limit a lot of unnecessary start and stops to my work, if I can just kind of be flowing with things. And that also just comes from a really concentrated knowledge of the materials that I use. You know, I've really honed in on like a pretty short list of materials that I use, and knowing that I have just the knowledge of several techniques, like I can be, you know, really succinct about like every piece that I use. And that's why I really have fallen in love with casting so much is that, with casting and with the materials that you cast in, the shapes that you can get out of them can be distinct as each snowflake that falls on the ground. So you can really start with an idea, but with a cast and me just thinking modularly and with units, I can really achieve like a certain illustration of the real world without having to come out of a certain comfortability with how much I'm using. Like I'm really aware of that, how much I'm using. So I think that's where that sentiment comes from. And there is a romance to that kind of thought. I mean, I don't really think of it so much as romantic, but I think the romance really comes with the care that I, really comfort the objects with, really playing with each detail and the textures that comes with them. I really adorn them in that way.
Well, I really like what you said about what casting affords you materially, because I think, so often, like October and everyone who talks about Rodin having drawers of hands and heads and all these, infinite supply of bodily parts that he can just reconfigure and put together. As a postmodernist practice, the artist, although interested in concept, is like more literally just interested in, like you said, how much can you push with materials? How much can you experiment when you have copy after copy after copy? Each one's slightly different, has its own affect, but it really gives you a chance to grow and push this language at such a rapid pace, which is wonderful. I'm interested in these last few slides and this one too. I don't know if it's a productive question, but how indexical are you keeping yourself when you're thinking about these works? Sometimes the color seems very literal. It seems to be temporal or like suggesting how old or new something is. But then there are these shocks of like almost neon greens or that really intense red. Are those improvisational on your part, or are you trying to stick closely to the things as you're finding them?
Do you mean as far as like the forms themselves or like the armatures?
Oh, yeah. Like how,
Yeah.
I mean, obviously this is the combination of multiple things, but in terms of color, how much are you looking at the thing you're finding and staying to it versus getting into something more enchanted or surrealist with your color?
I see. Yeah, I think for me, just I know that, for instance, if I'm using a cast of these like gourds or these kind of fruits that we see here, I just know that every fruit is just like at a different stage of its ripeness. Or say, for instance, if you were to go to the store and you pick out five mangoes, that blend of that red skin to the green, it's just a daily, what's inside of the object is really unknown to us. I think that's why I'm so obsessed maybe with like the kind of natural forms, is that like you just don't know when that color is going to change. Like that's going to be doing its own thing. We approximate. So I think for me, it's less about this enchanted fantastical color moment, but I'm maybe more thinking of this temporal accuracy of something that has several shades, so that we never really know here like what is too ripe, maybe on its way out, but maybe something that is pushing towards like needing to be plucked from the tree like right now. And so I think for me, I like to think of myself painting as anticipating maybe a color or a scheme that is, when we're looking at it, maybe like perhaps static, but also when we encounter that object in the round, perhaps like it's a space where those forms have been growing and ripening on their own time scale. So there's a way I'm trying to fit in all three stages of like past, present, and perhaps a future in like one work. And so I'm really interested in the ways in which like color denotes that, obviously. But I think for me, now moving to talking about like the armatures that I paint, that's maybe like a memory space for me. I think I pick a lot of the colors more universally, right? I think I'm really interested in the ways nature is so extravagant, but our built world could never really be. There's a very generic quality to the style of cabinetry or just like basic functions of things. And so when there's that schism between the armature, this interior space, and these kind of natural root systems, or these kind of like bursting amalgams of nature, for me, that's where the color gets really interesting for me, because it's almost not in vogue to be so cavalier with like colors, right? And like so much of our built world is this very ship to owner relationship. I think less and less about color because it's just really not so available, right? Like heirlooms and things like that are so ornate that we have, and those are our coveted pieces in our homes, right? But like, say for instance, if I was living in a council estate or, you know, in a NYCHA building, you know, that's given to you but, you know, just inherently it's a given. You know, you don't get to rapidly kind of have that taste or have that separate feeling of being experimental when there's a program, there's a hierarchy, there's a structure to like where you live, right? And so units, yeah, you can literally look up the dimensions of a NYCHA unit, and they're more or less the same, right? The layouts are actually more or less the same. And another relationship to color is in the ways that these systems, these city systems have, you know, ultra green, ultra blue. These are these, in a way, like thinking almost like Matt Mulliken, where he thinks about color in a very this metaphysical way, this semiotic way, where brain and color denote certain things, like, you know, just stop signs. Orange on the road means there's road work. So those relationships to color that deal with the urban and deal with systems of basically corralling people into rules. I'm very interested in the ways in which color can be playing with that, but also be illustrative and lush and layered too. So in each sculpture, I like to hold those spaces where color is very simple and color is very accessible and tasteful. But again, there's nature's color that is just so many, you know, and being a painter is a very like sensual space to be in.
It's brilliant, because I mean, I think that you've talked before about, you know, objects make us have a sense of being a subject, and there's this back and forth between the objects around us also informing us as a subject that you get into, like you said, like that. The philosophers and the thinkers that think about objects as this inert static thing that we impose our reality on lose sense, like you said, about disadvantaged communities who are inheriting things and how objects inform our sense of subject. And if you're not the consumer, if you're not picking everything, you know, different iPhones or different whatever by color, it imposes this other structural thing on you that is government decided, involves funding and really the structuring of a city or the structuring of a state to decide where it wants to put its importance. Really interesting. And I like that. I mean, when I look at these things, you're taking inert objects and really giving them senses of movement, senses of like expansion within crevices or like small spaces or spill, like this thing, like the way the plates hang off and create that kind of that sense that everything could fall apart, or this lean that you have in this sculpture is really dramatic and nice.
Yeah, I think a lot about, thank you, by the way, but I think a lot about these objects or these sculptures that I'm doing as they're very static, but they're also, yeah, they do have a sense of this movement or spilling out of. And so for me, that's a visual representation of like maybe these structures trying to break out of that kind of, yeah, just that tight box of simple or just enough. You know, there's not a lot of flair to a lot of these static objects that I end up making, but I think the flair is in that unseen drama. I think that happens where things are reclaimed, but once they leave a dwelling, or when they're interacted with, or they have, you know, the evidence of use. And for me, I think I also illustrate that in my work, because it just, when I see objects jettisoned like just elsewhere or just out in the street, it just is a reminder for me. It's like we're alive, like we're really here, and we're using things, and we build things, and those things crumble. And there's also the fact that on the other side of it, like we were saying before, there's like a lot of decisions that go unacknowledged or taken away from people who are reliant on a structure, right? And so the easiest way, I assume, for governments to just denote and just to place people is to just give them a schema that is very easy to contend with, right? And so again, I think it's also interesting to think about the urban center and the space of a generic good, because again, it's also historical, right? It's like typically brown and black people in this country have been stripped of things being passed down, right? So in any rate, if things are passed down, it's very recently. And you'll see how in those communities objects are actually treated, right? Everybody who's familiar will be, chuckling about, how grandma's chair is wrapped in that 5mm vinyl with a zipper on the back, right? And that's the good chair that you can't sit on, right? And so the idea of being so tethered with objects and holding on to its kind of mint or pristine quality it's actually such an intense necessity for so many, because them not having, right, and not being able to just live in this disposable economy of fiberboard and particle board, fast fashion. And so for me, a lot of times you'll see like these objects doning some type of curved or hand-turned bottom or things like that, because I think for me, although fictive, for me it's coupled with that. It's coupled with the ideas of which things with flair and things with kind of a devout quality aren't so available, right? There's typical times where you just see a building that's either been condemned or someone's been convicted. You'll see DSNY en masse carry out very similar looking minimal cabinetry and furniture, and it just goes straight into the mulcher, or it goes to a salvage yard. And so I think about the life cycles of those things, and for me, those kind of natural growths are that drama. I think it's maybe about the schism between something that's an inherent personal or familial history or vernacular, inheriting these kind of banal, almost exiled, jailed looking structures, these 3D structures, right? And so these communities that I'm engaging in and that I'm a part of, we express ourselves through food and culture. And so where you get a lot of these objects from me is that schism, is that we're living in a very regimented and in some ways a very basic existence, but the flair is maybe through where we come from and where we how we eat and how we put our things away. And maybe the movement or the action is these objects in a fictive way, or maybe reclaiming that space.
Well, completely. I mean, I'm just so impressed with this ability to time jump in all of your works, like the sensibility of what to pick to cast. Because like you're saying, that it brings up all these wonderful things naturally on their own about like futurity, like who has the agency and ability to imagine a future, and like who has the luxury of like seeing themselves in a future space. But going back to what you're saying, like nostalgia also becomes this thing pulled into question, which is the luxury of nostalgia, and like how the power structure that's revealed when people talk about cultural nostalgia, or like the ability to look back, that implies a singular viewpoint on that. And the ability to jump back to mid-century modern or Bauhaus or back to these styles, when, like you said, like the last two slides, like the furniture you're choosing are not about any, like they have the big thick legs that are meant to just last forever, and they have this like this banal vernacular, like you're saying, that's kind of reflecting out any ability to like see it as a style or a design or anything. It's really interesting that your choice in these materials or furniture that you're finding.
Yeah, I think that there is underlying that culture and nostalgia, and what to do with it is that I think for many people in the country and throughout the world, there's just the idea of choice versus exclusion of that choice, right? And so, throughout history, we obviously can identify with and see the still remnants of being here and being there, and how starkly different they can be, right? And like what is available. So that idea of like exclusion of availability is still very real. And I think that style for some is that's the second scoop of ice cream for their life, right? It's like, what style do I get to choose? I need a couch, but I need, like, what style do I like? Whereas some, of course, a couch will do. And so for me, I like the idea of, in the round, either Frankensteining or just completely making up my own furniture is, yeah, the idea that in some ways, the furnitures are, again, like a portal to be talking about these contexts, and maybe in the fact that it can be looked at, the objects just need a home, and they need a substructure in itself. And so, yeah, I don't get too ornate with the furnitures, because that's creeping sort of to a specificity, and perhaps, like we were saying, a style. And so I want the works to be felt universally. Those who are super stylish, just those are to some in which those audience members can just identify it very, very cleanly and just say, you know, that cabinet, or that baseboard, or that credenza, you know.
Yeah, it reminds me of how you're talking about too, of like the concept of the bohemian, of this, like the class luxury of petty bourgeois, that you can express yourself through what you wear and express yourself through what you buy, and the expression that comes from the liberty of class, that seems to be questioned here. The other thing that I really like about these is this motif that keeps happening, like I said, of this like smashing, or this like confined space, or spilling out. It's like the physics of a crawl space, or like it has these like tight, compact things within the walls, or between the floors. And I think it's psychologically very interesting that, like, stories of what people find in their crawl spaces when they're renovating their house or their apartment always return like top results, you know, like there's this fascination and fear of like, what did we inherit, or what came with the house, or what came with the apartment that we moved into. I think you're getting it too.
Yeah, I think there is sort of that thought process of, you know, when we inherit, it's not only what do we do with it, how do we value it, but like what was the previous owner and their relationship to it. We might know that story, but it's interesting. I think so much about, you know, the quality differences of things. You know, older things are typically just like well built. There wasn't MDF back in the day. It was mostly, things were just made out of wood, and, you know, really just had their time and taken with how they were built. But for me, I like to think of that psychological like cramming as an urgency. For me, the objects are kind of jutting out, bursting out, because I think it's urgent for them, and it's almost like an illustration on the real urgency and struggle for things to be growing, whether that is analogous or almost like a metaphorical space to a burgeoning community that is, you know, here, seemingly invisible and seemingly unwanted, but in this substructure of this tight or falling in line to a status quo. And I like to think of those objects sometimes as that analog to here I am, I'm in this substructure, I'm different, and we're going to find a way to cohabit.
Completely. I mean, I love the use of the word analog in relationship to this, because like a lot of the ways you're discussing it as these shapes of time or structures of time or structuring time, it has this language of flat ontology, or, you know, that we're seeing every object in a moment of going from dust to a form and then back to dust and changing. And something that I think gets artists so excited about flat ontology is this understanding that, like you said, we're taking snapshots, or we're like trying to get precise with what moment are we pausing for a second to really understand it in that moment.
Right.
And maybe this would be a good place. I'd love to hear you talk more about, you've said before, every sculpture you take on has this journalistic moment, or this moment in time that kind of begins or initiates you into dealing with it. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah, so this idea of like a journalistic moment is sort of that same idea of like a snapshot or a setting up of a situation in my mind before I go to the studio, or even perhaps it's like taking a break from a studio if I take a walk or something. But I like to think of that journalistic moment as the way an object can activate just an overarching conversation or overarching reality, and in such a kind of artistic way that I don't really know another word to kind of describe that, but it's so sort of dramatic and artistic to think about, a line of people's belongings that are on the street, and it's like literally that can be like, if we can think of those objects literally as the people who had inherited them or who abandoned them or were forcibly had to remove them from their care. And so that journalistic moment for me is literally a snapshot. Sometimes where I'm like on my phone, I'm thinking, wow, this is very uncanny. Not necessarily thinking of like the same material choices that are here in front of me, but maybe for me, it's, okay, wow, I really like how this person, has dragged together a home out of, desperate materials here, like an unhoused person, say, for example. Or, I can really get a sense of, what people are even dealing with economically, or even like what they're eating here, because I know that there's 10 Twizzlers boxes out, or I just see one restaurant over and over down the street. I'm like, okay, wow, I know I just walked past the food desert, but I'm now getting the density of that reality here. And so those are those like journalistic moments that maybe mean nothing in the moment. Maybe it's just like an experience, and it might not just every experience lead to an artwork or say, but I would say it's more of a collection of these small passing moments that lead me to think about all that we're talking about today, maybe. And so I use it as a device. It's maybe one could even say like that journalistic moment can be brought on just by intuition or something. And maybe I'm just already looking for a bit of inspiration. But when I really find that moment happen, I end up taking note either of how the form looks or just a closer analysis of what's maybe happening in and around like my body, and knowing that if I were to zoom out, my body is part of several others, and we're on a block, and then we're on a street, and then we're in a borough, and then so from there it's kind of like canopied up outward. So I feel like that journalistic moment is almost like just a microscope. It's almost like a microscopic moment too.
Interesting. I mean, this takes us up into the shade tree, which is currently up, and kind of the good impetus for seeking to have this wonderful conversation. Am I correct that the journalistic moment kind of dictated the idea for this work first, or you came across this, or you started thinking about what to do with the space from coming across an article in the LA Times, I believe?
Yeah. So this project that I finished in May this year started from just the realities of thinking of objects and how are a part of a larger schema of architecture, basically. And in that article was just kind of dealing with the realities of LA, this sprawling metropolis of concrete and sidewalks, is just exorbitantly so much hotter in the lower income neighborhoods of LA than those of the surrounding suburbs, due to the fact that there is just a lack of shade in the urban areas. And there's much has been written about this, but I found it as like kind of interesting parameter to work with, especially now that I knew that this project was going to be taking place outside. It was like, wow, here is a manicured sculpture park that is covered with foliage and trees, and my work deals with the outside coming inside, and that kind of and that kind of realm, and like that dichotomy. And so for me, I really wanted to engage a project that, again, is so full of, in my thinking, full of humanity and dealing with people, and that the only thing really missing in my work is like people engaging with it. Mm-hmm. So I feel like the objects so much take on this personified aura. And so I made shade trees basically as a direct illustration of that idea of these objects getting shade from, you know, baking on the concrete all day, and almost like as if these objects have clumped together in refuge to get away from that reality. And here is like these two kind of polar opposites, these trashed or kind of jettisoned materials like old headboards and you know, mirror frames and lawn chairs and these kind of sitting stumps, you know, congealing under this large maple tree. So for me, it was like a direct correlation between a real problem that is dealt with in the urban realities of today, and then just kind of this moment almost as like this urban oasis outside.
Yeah, I'm interested to, if we could go to maybe the next slide, because it's interesting to see how your drawings of the idea start with this kind of stacking, again, like a stack of, you see like on the curb, or you see on trash pickup day, it's like trying to not take up space. You form these strange totemic sculptures. And then the piece shade tree itself turned into more of a field, or turned in more into like kind of a ring around the tree. What led you to go away from the drawing, or what was it, the materials, or was it the process, or what? I'm interested in what you learned from the materials and the process that took you to where it ended up.
Yeah, I mean, this project at Storm King is actually my first outdoor commission. So I think for me, it was knowing that dimensions variable is almost not enough of a term to like describe how when you eliminate walls and you know, things of that nature, you're really contending with the grounds that you're on so much more concretely and frontally. And so there's a way in which I was learning how to work with an armature, work with and contending with nature, right? Because there was actually an instance where shade tree was actually supposed to be multiple trees on the ground. And we ended up not doing every tree or like many of the trees because the roots were in the way of putting in the steel beam armature for the cast, so much so that if we were to go along with it, the tree would potentially be harmed. And so we had to alter so many things that just were unknowable to me at the start, because we were trying something that was an arrangement that we hadn't worked with before. And there was also the ways in which stacking, and you're right, in the ways in which like trash collection needs to be arranged in a sort of tidy way, so that the workers can quickly dispose of it. But my thought actually, the spreading out of the works rather than the stacking came from, it's not so well illustrated so far, but the works actually extend to the widest width of the canopy of the branches under the tree. So the work is more lateral than it is vertical because of the work around and in that circle extends to the width of the widest branch under that tree. And same with the manicured ring around the tree. I wanted it to, again, like achieve this idea that you're literally transported into this other time. And so that grass under the tree, part of the curation of that work is that grass will continue to grow in that kind of stanchion circle while they continue to manicure a path around it. So there's a boundary, but there's a boundary to that portal that is, you kind of walk in and engage around.
Yeah, I mean, I just love these moments where the idea gets changed and moved into what it needs to be, or the work tells you what it needs to be. Because I love where the piece ended. Like you said, the sculptures kind of become a mirror of the shade of the tree at noon, or like when the sun is directly above. And you find the boundary, you find the edge in a different way. Like something I was interested in when we talked before, as a painter, you coming from a background of painting, which is all about relating to the boundary of the edge. Your works previously in this presentation, you're using the furniture oftentimes like containers or like edges or rectangles or frames to everything. And this seems really like a new, fresh move of like kind of finding the frame based on shadow and nature and a new boundary. It's really exciting.
Yeah, I had a lot of fun letting go of what I'm used to here, and working outside is probably the easiest way, I think, for a sculptor to really be in collaboration with the space that they're showing with. You know, there is a lot of things that you have to maybe let go of so tightly when working outside, because of just the elements. And, you know, just funny enough with my work and how much I speak about time and how I paint artifice as if the elements in time have weathered it and aged it, you know, this was a chance for me to really let that do its thing here. Slowly throughout the installation, the colors of each cast will change, of course, and just natural weathering will happen. And so it was an invitation for my work to kind of really go through that practice outside of myself trying to hold tight and like dictate what that would maybe look like. It was maybe a real-time scenario for me to engage with a lot of these topics that I'm actually thinking about. So it was great.
Yeah, I really love this image, the lawn chair, because I think the color is used so well to dictate a kind of rust or or an earthness to it, that this is the moment for me where it really becomes this kind of like the reality kind of vibrates or wiggles a little bit. You realize that all of this is artifice, that the lawn chair is turned to rust as well. But something that I was thinking about in regard to this piece is, I don't know, there's a kind of commons created in all of it, or there's something maybe utopic or wonderful. It reminds me of the times on a really hot day where everyone sits close together to hide under the shadow of a tree, you know,
Yep.
and how close we'll get in those situations. I think it's a really poignant and beautiful gesture and next step of your practice. It's a really wonderful work.
Thank you.
Well, I want to leave some time for everyone else's questions, because I see that we have a lot of them going and a lot of comments, because of just how rich and dimensional and how much you're pushing into these objects and reclaiming these things and what you're doing with temporal shifting. It's a real privilege to get to talk to you today, Brandon, and get to hear you talk about all of this. But I also want to be cognizant of, as much as we keep going, and certainly I want to pester you with questions beyond this and keep talking about all this, I want to give a chance for our audience and our community to get to ask you some too. But thank you so much for your time today, Brandon, and for the this care and consideration of developing these senses of time where we need them most. Thank you.
It's my pleasure, Andrew. It's honestly been a treat, and thanks so much for this deep read into the work. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thank you.
Amazing. Thank you both so much. This has been incredible. Yeah, I could do like part two maybe. So yeah, we have a couple of questions. The first is from our friend GE. You can go ahead and unmute to ask.
Thank you, Carolyn, and Andrew and Brandon. Thank you so very much. It seems that there seems to be so much wonderful science and kind of science regard in the work, as well as the other things, certainly politically and socially. And with all the science regard in your work, I have to wonder, is your studio sometimes kind of as much of a laboratory? And if so, or what is going on there?
Thanks, GE. I mean, it's not so much. It's more like a dry lab. It's maybe not so like there's no petri dishes going on. I'm not really growing anything, but I do think like there is sort of it's maybe more like Mary Shelley, Frankenstein. It's more like things are in half, things are kind of split open. I really, at an atomic level, start into something and then go out. So, you know, I'm seeing everything, and I'm thinking of things knowing that it's starting as a liquid and going to end as a solid. So I leave a lot of it to what I'm going to see, almost like trials. I maybe do a lot of copies of one thing and to say, okay, this is just glue, this is just wood and dust and glue, or this is resin with no pigment, this has pigment in it. And just to see, you know, what qualities of each cast like work. And then I think I'll take the best one and maybe start from there. But each one has its place. Like each cast definitely has its place. And so the lab is maybe more like, because I don't know, for me, laboratory seems a bit more tight. I don't leave it so tight, and I don't really chart too many things. It's more, I'm more playing, but I know what I want to see, if that makes sense.
Oh, absolutely. And I almost see it also as like reanimations of things too. So yeah. Again, that's the Shelley illusion. So that's so wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thank you.
Thanks, GE, for that question. The next one we're going to read for Michael, maybe in line with some Frankenstein romanticism stuff. He was asking, is romanticism formal? Isn't romanticism a reaction against the formal? So maybe if you can or want to, I guess, elaborate on what that means for your work.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, I think from what I understand is like, the romantic is, I think it is a form. I think like, I think nature is really romantic. I think it's really like, you know, touching when two branches kind of like twist as a braid or something, or, you know, that there's, or the way that chain link fence gets swallowed up by a tree like growing around it, right? And so you can't anticipate those things. And so it's also for me thinking about just like how a solid thing like that is still growing could end up being like described almost like liquid, you know? And so that liquidity, I think, is maybe that romantic part. I do think that separating the romantic and formal is, I don't know if I separate them. I think like the romantic and like the romantic gesture is a form and a way to describe the world and like the inner world even. But I think for me, like the romantic part comes from, like I was saying before, I think it becomes from the treatment. I think there's like a deep care that you can really take a material into a certain place, that you can really treat a thing that is, you know, of one constitution, and over time, like with care and intent, you can really create something that is besides itself in a material. So yeah, I think in the other definition of like the romantic, yeah, I'm not so delicate as it seems though at the same time. Like I think I do leave things to be pretty raw, and you know, I think which of course can lead to its own kind of like romanticism. I guess what I'm trying to say is that like some things are treated just differently. I don't think every sculpture of mine has the same amount of adornment or care, and that's perhaps on purpose. So I hope that answers maybe the question.
I don't want to codify Brandon, but something I was thinking of to maybe jump off that is there's the book Romanticism Against the Tide of Modernity that I really enjoy, but I don't, you know, agree or disagree with it, because there are lots of ways to shape romanticism, but they do an interesting thing of trying to shape it within time. That future romanticism is the utopic or the techno-utopic, it's the humanist. Past romanticism is nostalgic and conservative and leans fascist, but romanticism of the now is enchantment with the everyday, and it's surrealist. And I think that maybe without codifying your practice, I think there's a romanticism in the temporal moment of now, like an enchantment, but I think you're trying to critique the temporal past and you're suspicious of the temporal future, potentially.
I would agree. I would agree with that. I think the engagement is like, I'm never really trying to rush towards, because I also feel like I can't really see the future, right? And it's like, you know, I'm not so concerned. Like, I think the past, you know, is definitely still part of this present, but like, yeah, I can only really see what I'm really seeing it, or I can touch rather. Maybe it's not that I can't really see the future, but like I need to touch the thing, right? So I can really know it, and maybe not try and illustrate something that's not really there yet. But yeah, so I would agree with that.
Thank you all. We have a question next, or I should also say, if anybody wants to get in your last minute question, go ahead and type it in the chat for Brandon. Our next one is from Raven, very own Raven. You can go ahead.
Hi. So I wanted to know a little bit more about how or what your process is like when you're titling your work.
Titles. So titles for me are a little elusive. Admittedly, it's not something like I think of like first. Like I really think of like making the object first. And so titles for me, they're kind of they kind of go everywhere. I don't really have a system with how I title my work. Some of them are more tongue-in-cheek titles. Some of them are either words that I have found, like implied language to things and products. Like a lot of them are titles of products. So say for instance, that black cabinet in that first slide is a Danish word for comfort. And that was something I saw just in and around companies that just title their work in a similar fashion. And so there's that. I think for me, I also use a lot of, just like product and real world titles of things. Because I think for me, that is the way that I find a kind of sublime in the everyday is, a description of a color green, is analog to the real world and like what they're maybe thinking that color reminds their product of, pistachio green or something. And I think in that way, it's like, again, I'm just still trying to think of like this everyday moment where the things that we engage with and buy and produce are they're so tethered to the unnameable, the nature, the kind of sublime. And so when we engage with ourselves as separate from nature and we're just talking to ourselves as just like people, we do have a way of being like very illustrative, and we use the kind of natural world to kind of describe the things around us. And so, I think a lot of titles come from that, but I don't really have like a thorough or a beautiful story about how I title my work.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Brandon. Maybe a new book just of your titles. They're good ones. It's like poetry. Well, that's that for our questions. Thank you again, everybody who had some questions. And we end our community events at the Rail with a reading. And I'm really, really excited to introduce our poet laureate of the day, Miko. Miko Revereza is an experimental documentary filmmaker and writer. His work examines migration in relation to moving images, interrogating documentation and how they relate to nationhood and documentary. How does an undocumented documentary filmmaker document themselves is a central question investigated through his moving images. His works have been exhibited at institutions such as MoMA, the Smithsonian National Gallery of Art, and Whitechapel Gallery. Revereza was a 2019 Flaherty Seminar featured filmmaker, 2021 Bill Sick Prize winner, a recent recipient of Wendy's Subway Open Reading Period Book Prize, and holds an MFA from Bard. Thank you so much, Miko, for being here. And pass it over to you.
Hi, thanks so much, Carolyn. Thanks so much, Brandon. Such a pleasure, and it was so great to see and listen to this expansive conversation about your work. I met Brandon at Bard, and we were in the same, and Carolyn as well. We were all in the same graduating year, and yeah, it's just I'm in awe to just sort of see the seeds that you were experimenting with throughout those years have kind of blossomed and has grown. And it's, yeah, I just want to, it's really inspiring to this conversation. And also I was really thrown off because I was kind of inspired. I had this whole like reading planned and I had it already. And then throughout the conversation, I was like, oh, I have this other part of this book I'm working on that like connects more with like disposability and inheritance. So then it's like, oh, I have to scramble and find this bit. But yeah, I'm just gonna read a bit, something unprepared, and then let's see how that goes. I kind of like that feeling of, well, I don't know. I don't know how how it feels actually, but just gonna read from this forthcoming book from Wendy Subway in Brooklyn called Nowhere Near, and it's also a film that I'm working on. And this excerpt is about going with my grandmother to her home province of Binmale, Pangasinan. That day trip was confusing to film. As we entered the town through the bridge, Lola would criticize the state of what her hometown looks like today. The municipal building, the town square that was bombed during the war. Ang pangit na. It's ugly now. The bell tower is still amazing. The church building was rebuilt after the war. We enter, the sound of bats. I'm trying to find my way without so much light, trying to keep up with Lola and Tito Joseph, who also look lost. So the nun in the corner starts a conversation with us. Lola asks about the tombstones on the floor and the whereabouts of her grandfathers, which is supposed to be right there in the center aisle as one descends from the altar, a most honorable location to put a tombstone, but apparently it's no longer there. It could be because the whole church was remodeled, because all of this used to be carpeted, but they say what I heard was the tombstone was moved. The nun was transferred to this church 6 years ago, but has noticed these old plaques with names on them scattered around. Estacio Lopez is the name we are looking for. You guys live in Manila? Lola trails off and evades the question, mumbling something I can't decipher. The nun calls for someone named PJ, the young man who cleans the church. PJ might have a better idea of where the tombstone could be. Here's one, there between the aisles, one over there, one over there, one over there. This one's not the one. I'm struggling to capture the scene. The air was heavy, my motions were erratic, my hands shaky. The exposure's too dark. Why didn't I change it? As if these were not my gestures moving the camera, but some other force directing the lens. My apo is making a documentary, English speaking. Where in the US? LA. She was assigned in Hawaii for 8 years. She hopes to find the man who cleans the church. At 7:30 a.m., she's leaving. There's a tombstone in every corner. Their voices go in and out as it travels through the cavernous reverb. Over there. No, over there. This is the young man she was talking about, PJ. Lola insists it should be right there in the center, before the church building was wrecked. However, some years ago, not so distant, her nephew was here and took a photo of the tombstone, proving its existence. But in the photo showed the tombstone no longer displayed the Spanish-appointed petite honor that Estacio held as the gobernadorcillo of the town. And it was definitely not in the center aisle, which raised the suspicion in Lola's mind that it was moved not only intentionally, but maliciously. The nun clocks out of her shift and PJ takes over the search. He is from Binmale. He and Lola speak in Pangasinan. No, this one's not the one either. 1877 to 1910. We're at a loss. Lola goes to pray. I wander around the church, not not necessarily looking for the tombstone anymore, just looking. I'm such a shitty cinematographer today. Hardly got any sleep. It's like the camera is possessed. We were all possessed for centuries. There is a saying that the modern Filipino psyche is comprised of 300 years in the convent and 50 years in Hollywood. If that is true, this is perhaps the exact site of that shift in consciousness when Hollywood bombs landed on the Spanish convent. And after all of this time, we have returned from Los Angeles, out of all places, and have come here to make a movie. Lola and PJ are over by the organ. Tito Joseph calls me over. There it is. PJ found it. Under the organ bench, a tombstone written out in Spanish. This is what Lola was looking for. She is still unfulfilled, confused at why it's off to the side under the organ bench when she remembers it clearly at the center of the church with the honorable title Gobernadorcillo inscribed across it. She accuses that it was moved, displaced from its original position after the war. It was us who were displaced after the war, fractured like the Filipino psyche. I examine the relics of the Spanish regime, of saints we name children after. A funeral procession approaches. Before we leave, PJ takes us up to the bell tower. It is more intimidating from the inside. Tito Joseph snaps a photo of a view of the lookout, and I imagine this concrete frame in a time lapse of 300 years. This was the beach where they landed, MacArthur and them, in their invasion of this gulf, a convoy of pregnant battleships, 800 vessels off the coastline, crossfire between water and sky, bellies bursting, hatching 900 amphibious tanks and 2,500 landing crafts carrying young men from low-income neighborhoods across America, strapped with rifles, crawling up the shoreline, ready to blast on first sight of a Japanese hostility. But to MacArthur's surprise, there were none, just like the local informants told them days ago, right before the Navy went ahead and bombarded the entire coastline for 3 straight days for the classically flawed all-American reasoning of good measure. What could be more symbolic? In true Hollywood fashion, nothing spells out liberation like bombing a religious structure. Beachhead areas were left virtually deserted by residents. The army treated the civilians injured in their bombardment. They offer intel on the whereabouts of Japanese forces. The Americans capture a cratered Japanese airstrip. Locals help repair the airstrip for incoming US planes in exchange for clothes from America. No, Lola hasn't actually seen Douglas MacArthur with her own eyes. There's enough ephemera and statues and photos in school textbooks circulating across the Philippines of the general arrogantly stomping through the water, fat cigar clenched between vindictive grin aviators that conceal a man's humanity. Today, the beach is lined with fishing boats. It is not as she remembers it. Sunglasses mask the melancholia. Not entirely, though. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Miko, so much. I'm glad you read that one. Yeah. Yeah, so everybody check the chat out for some links. Miko has an upcoming book. Please go see the show at Storm King if you can get up there. It's really incredible, Brandon, to have you on. Thank you so much. Thank you, Andrew, for guiding us through. Yeah, we'd also like to thank Michael and Gabrielle from Bureau. Over the past 22 years, the Brooklyn Rail has brought together art, music, dance, film, theater, literature, and thoughtful social and political meditations, like here in our daily NSE. Please check the chat for a link to donate, and you can join us tomorrow at 1 p.m. for a conversation on rail curatorial projects, singing in unison with Fong H. Bui, Frank Maresca, Tamara Gonzalez, Sam Esser, EJ Hauser, Vera Letter, and Lyle Rexer. And we will conclude with a poetry reading by Carla Harriman. And this is getting recorded, so check our archives shortly. This will be up and you can share the conversation. And yeah, turn your microphones on. Everybody should be able to unmute and say hi, bye. As you go, thank you all again so much.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you so
Thank
much,
you.
Miko,
Thank
for that
you.
reading. Thank you, Brandon and Andrew.
Andrew, thank you, Miko.
Thank you. Thanks,
This
Brooklyn.
was wonderful. Thank you.
Everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Good Monday.
Cool. Thanks, Brandon. Yeah, what a Monday.
Sorry.
That's it.
And it's only
Week's over.
Monday.
Yeah.
I know. Thanks, everybody.
That was
Thank
really
you.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Take
Thank
care.
you guys. Have a good one.
Happy Monday, everyone.
Lunchtime.
Happy Monday. Hi, Caroline,
Bye.
Nico.
Thank you guys.
Yay.
Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
doing
So
this.
good.
It's so great.
Wow. So
All
good
right,
to see you
Amazing.
we'll
guys.
be in Oaxaca next.
Yep.
Yes, we're coming,
True.
Nico.
We're all invited.
Everyone's invited.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Have a good one.
Bye, guys.
Okay. See you.